Most Democrats are just fine with this kind of totalitarian state that the bureaucrats are pushing on us. But Republicans at least pretend to be against these things. But what are we going to do this September? We're going to fund every freaking one of those things that we have exposed. That is the tool that we have, is the funding. Why are we funding things we don't like? We don't have to. Well, it's because we're addicted to spending. Can we be honest with the American people about what's going on here? This is political theater. I'm going to call out both sides right here. It's all posturing, it's fake fighting. We all know where it ends up. This is Groundhog Day. I don't care if the Democrat is the speaker or Republican is the speaker. We always get a CR in September, and then we get an omnibus. Sometimes there's a twist on that. We might get the omnibus before Christmas, but if we're not good, it comes after Christmas. But that's what's going to happen. And in the meantime, it's political theater. We've got it's good theater. We've got great writers. I wish they'd just come up with a new plot. It's the same plot every fiscal year. What should we be doing? It's already been discussed. We should have done 12 separate bills. We should have done 12 separate bills. But again, whether Democrats are in control or Republicans are in control, we never do the 12 separate bills. Why do we always spend at least as much as we did last year, and why do we never cut spending? It's because Democrats want to grow the welfare state, and Republicans want to grow the military-industrial complex. And we're eventually going to get together, and they're both going to go up. I guarantee it. And both parties are just fine letting the bureaucrats do their thing, which should be our thing, according to Article 1. Section 8 in the Constitution. We are empowered with these things. Most important of the things we do is the funding, and that's the big lever we have. I've sat through now almost 2 years of hearings in this Congress where we've exposed lies at the CDC, shortcuts at the FDA, unconstitutional gun bans at the ATF, over prosecution of January 6ers at the DOJ, targeting common citizens at the FBI, spying by the NSA, illegal mandates for livestock by the USDA, targeting plant vaccine or transgenic plant vaccine at the NSF, and censorship, the censorship industrial complex of which the NSF is part of, automobile kill switch at the DOT. Now, these are all things I think most Democrats are just fine with this kind of totalitarian state that the bureaucrats are pushing on us. But Republicans at least pretend to be against these things. But what are we going to do this September? We're going to fund every freaking one of those things that we have exposed. That is the tool that we have, is the funding. Why are we funding things we don't like? We don't have to. Well, it's because we're addicted to spending. And this doesn't do anything about the addiction at all. So let me touch on one point too here that I think is important. A couple years ago, or a summer and a half ago, I suppose now, we did something where we allowed the debt limit to be increased. But as a condition of that, we said if you do a CR that lasts past April 30th, everything's going to get cut 1%. And that, to me, seemed like at least a little tinge of fiscal responsibility was creeping in. But now I notice that this CR, instead of going 1 year and giving us time to do the 12 appropriations bills, is going to go 6 months. Now, let me tell you what's going to happen because this goes 6 months. Number one, it ends in March 28th, on March 28th. Well, the automatic cuts happen on April 30th if the CR went past that. So that is exactly why the Speaker chose a 6-month CR, is so we don't have even the chance, a threat to this town, it's a threat of a 1% cut. We don't want to even, this is like T-ball. The 1% cut is on the tee, and Republicans won't even swing at it. So instead, we're going to do a 6-month CR instead of a 1-year CR. That sets up another crisis next spring where we can do another pretend fight sometime around March. And that fight it'll be the same fight regardless of who wins the presidency and who's in charge of the Senate and the House. And we're basically going to get pretty much the same result. But that's 6 months from now. In the meantime, we can kick the can down the road. All of these things that we've exposed and all of these hearings are going to continue to get funded. But wait, there's a bright, shiny object on this CR. I've never seen one of these. I have never seen a bright, shiny object attached to one of these must-pass bills. Oh, wait, no. It actually happens. There always is. A bright, shiny object. A bauble, if you will. A little something to get excited about. This SAVE Act. It's going to save us all, right? And by the way, this is good political theater. I do like this part of it, that we're going to see almost every Democrat cast a vote so that illegals can vote in our elections. I mean, that's pretty clever on the part of our speaker to set that up, make you all take that vote. But here's what he's going to do after you take that vote. He's going to take it off. The bright, shiny object goes away. It's Lucy and the football again. And the American public is all revved up. Yeah, we're going to get to save it. We're going to save these elections. We're going to stop the illegals from voting. Really? How are you going to do that in like 6 weeks? I think they're already registered if they're going to vote. Some of them probably already voted. This SAVE Act ain't going to save anything. And particularly because it ain't ever going to become law. It's a false promise to get all the Republicans half pregnant. And then you're going to get fully pregnant by the end of September when you vote for this CR. That is not going to have this, I mean, I hate to break this to you. I mean, the Democrats already know this. I'm not telling you anything special. I hate to break it to the Republicans. You ain't getting the SAVE Act. It is not going to stay on this bill. Why? Because we're going to cave. We're going to cave. Is it a fight worth having? Absolutely, it's a fight worth having. Make those Democrats say they want illegals to vote. Make them take that vote as many times as you can. And then make them go to the ballot box in November. But that's what it is. It's political theater, folks. We all know where it ends up. We've seen it. I've been here 12 years. I've seen it 12 times. I refuse to be a thespian in this failure theater. This is what happens when you have a quantity of something and then you add more to it. This is dilution. The principle is so simple that a child can understand. And you can create this little science project at home. Sorry, you can have your tea back. Okay. But the principle is called dilution. And when you print $5 trillion and you put it into the economy, you have diluted the value of the money. You know, something interesting has happened with our debt here recently that hasn't happened in history, really. We got to about $26 trillion by borrowing money. And then most recently when COVID hit and the first $2 trillion package came to the floor, there weren't $2 trillion to borrow. It didn't exist in circulation. So what happened? How did we finance that debt? How do we finance that $2 trillion and the next $2 trillion and the next trillion? In fact, we financed $5 trillion of this debt by printing money. The Federal Reserve printed the money, and then the Treasury borrowed it from the Federal Reserve. So we kind of borrowed it from ourselves, but what came into existence was $5 trillion that did not exist before. Now, had we borrowed it, we would have taken it out of the economy, and then when the money was put back into the economy through various programs that were supposed to help businesses, and may or may not have had their intended effect, if we had borrowed the money and put the money back in, we wouldn't have increased the money in circulation. But what we did over the last 3 years is increase by $5 trillion the amount of money that's in circulation before the banks loaned it out fractionally. Mr. Raskin, do you think that creating new money and putting it into the economy had any effect on inflation?
But I assume it does, but I've not looked at the studies about that. I mean, you're talking about the QE2 lending program that the Fed set up with Treasury?
This is since QE2.
Yeah.
This was specifically for COVID. The Federal Reserve created $5 trillion. If you look at their graph, it's kind of flat for since 1917.
Yeah.
Their balance sheet. Then it went up $5 trillion right there at the, and so what that means is $5 trillion came from somewhere. What happened is they printed the money and then loaned it to Treasury. Then Treasury, well, we spent the money. I don't want to blame Treasury. Congress appropriated this money, and it went out the door, and then that went into people's hands, and they started buying stuff.
Right. No, I mean, that's a serious question, and certainly there are fiscal stimulus sources of inflation, and there are, and there are Fed sources of inflation as well. But they're not executive order sources of inflation. I mean, no economists have ever identified that. So, but that's a serious question, and of course,
Chip,
that goes.
your tea?
I mean, that goes way beyond the purview of this legislation.
So this is Chip Roy's tea. He doesn't need it anymore, I've decided. This is what happens when you have a quantity of something and then you add more to it. This is dilution. The principle is so simple that a child can understand. And you can create this little science project at home. Sorry, you can have your tea back. Okay. But the principle is called dilution. And when you print $5 trillion and you put it into the economy, you have diluted the value of the money. So for instance, if you had a minimum wage at some amount, and somebody was making minimum wage, and they were still making minimum wage after this money was printed, they actually are making considerably less in terms of real dollars. It's dilution. So the $5 trillion that we printed, I would argue, is the primary source of inflation. You know, we can say, well, eggs went up because feed went up, fuel went up because there's a war in Ukraine. You can find a lot of excuses for various different industries. But what is the probability that every price went up all at the same time? You can't blame them on specific supply chain problems. The thing
how do you explain the global?
Yes, I'm glad you asked me that, Professor Raskin. Because they did the same thing in Europe. They did this everywhere. They printed their own equivalents of the Federal Reserve and Treasuries, created their own money out of thin air. Mm-hmm. It may be the only thing that saved our dollar is that everybody else did the same thing to their currency. And so the question is, right now we're coming up on the debt limit. Why isn't anybody proposing to print more money? Why aren't the economists proposing to print more money? Because it is poison. When you print money, it is poison to our economy, and it is very regressive. Inflation is extremely regressive, especially when it affects the goods that everybody needs to buy. Energy. I love it when they print the consumer price index, neglecting food and energy and housing, right? Like the three things that no matter how poor you are, you still need. We'll just leave those out when we look at the effect of inflation, but you can't leave those things out. So the reason we're not, we could just print more money again like we did over the last 3 years, but the reality is everybody in this room knows, and if we don't, we have staff who know, that if you print money, you're going to wreck this economy. So I found it interesting that the Fed raised interest rates very aggressively over the last several quarters, the last year. Do you have any idea, Mr. Raskin, why they would raise interest rates?
I really don't. I've not followed it that closely. I mean, your line of questioning to me is interesting because I think it goes to what the real sources of inflation are in the economy and what the money supply is and so on. Remember that the various actions taken that you identified were in response to a crisis, which was COVID-19 and an economic collapse in the country, and everybody on a bipartisan basis, with perhaps the potential exception of you, was demanding that the federal government act in order to bolster the economy because the restaurants were going down and the hotels were going down and our businesses were collapsing. And so we make no apologies for any of the rescue legislation that we did, and we think we did the right thing, even if that was some small contributor to the overall global inflation that we saw. And I will say that, of course, this has been a bipartisan policy commitment. And under President Trump, we know that Your side of the aisle voted 3 times to lift the debt limit, as requested by President Trump. And President Trump's own spending contributed 25% of the total debt of the United States from George Washington to Joe Biden. 25% of it. So this is a bipartisan problem that we got to deal with.
I like those numbers where we look at which administration was in power when the debt went up and what percent, maybe 25% under Trump. The reality is we are the ones who raised the debt limit, not the president. So I went back and looked at to see under which speaker did the debt limit did the debt go up the most. And it turns out somewhere between 43 and 45% of all the debt, you mentioned that 25% of all the debt was under Trump. Using those same metrics, 43 to 45% of all the debt ever incurred in this country happened while Ms. Pelosi was Speaker. Now, she had a good run at it. She had 2 chances to do it. She was Speaker twice. But, so I think it's unfair to blame any one administration. I think it's more fair to blame us. And in reality, because we're the ones who raised it. Now, the problem with the stimulus that we did during COVID, yes, there was an economic calamity and people stayed home, but when you gave farmers money, when you gave people money, the farmers didn't make more goods, the factories didn't make more goods, the refineries didn't refine more oil. Demand for fuel went down, so we saw a temporary, if you look at inflation, it actually went down there for a while nobody was doing much of anything. But after we put that money in their hands, now they're chasing goods that don't exist. They literally buying the inventory because so many things were shut down.